So it's time for a little big picture thinking. You're used to thinking of your brain probably as the locus of your consciousness or some such thing, as a generator of all kinds of magic, mystical stuff. But we're going to keep our focus squarely on observables here without presuming too much about individual minds or anything of the sort. So we're taking a more or less a biological stance as we ask, what does the brain do? Now, the brain, we often refer to the brain. The brain is a part of a much larger thing called the nervous system, which has many subsystems. The central nervous system includes the brain and peripheral nervous system. And we also have the autonomous nervous system, which is regulating such vital functions as digestion, respiration, heartbeats, and so on. It might seem odd to ask, what does the brain do? Well, really what we're asking is, what do nervous systems do? And for that, we do actually have something of an answer. When we look at that part of the central nervous system known as the brain, we recognize in its immediate interactions with the other parts of the body that it regulates the chemical environment of the body. And that includes its own chemical environment. The brain is, of course, an electrochemical signaling system. So this is a peculiar organ indeed that regulates itself. But most of this is unseen, unfelt, has nothing or very little to do with anything we might think of as thinking or consciousness or anything like that. What else does the nervous system do? Well, it moves muscles. Nervous systems and muscles arrive at the same time in the evolutionary record. Brains don't come till much later, of course, but brains are a concentration of neurons that arises long after the basic principle of a distributed network of signaling, electrochemical signaling elements, or a nerve net, arises. So, on this view, what nervous systems seem to be there for is movement. That's why we're talking about movement. The basic principles of movement are held in common across species. The basic principles underlying the coordinated movement of a centipede can be compared to those of a bat or a fish or a human playing football. Now, this innovation, evolutionary innovation of nervous systems and muscles together, allowed animals for the first time to move around in their environments. This produced an enormous advantage in evolutionary terms. Food is, as you've noticed, not evenly distributed in most environments. You have to actually walk down to the hot dog stand to get a hot dog. Resting requires a different environment from feeding. We wouldn't ask you to sleep in your chair. And of course, there's the business of finding mates and reproducing, all of which involves an awful lot of movement. So as we peer back through time, the point at which nervous systems and muscles co-occur is very, very, very early on in the record. It dates back more than 500 million years ago, probably 600 or 700 million years ago, before, for those of you who are fans of such things, before the Cambrian explosion, before the appearance of bilaterally symmetric animals. But once it appears, once nerves and muscles jointly appear, the animal kingdom suddenly acquired the business of locomotion and movement. And with this, one organism can chase another one and eat it. So predator-prey relations open up. Of course, prior to the emergence of movement, organisms still got consumed by other organisms, but it was a bit of a chance relationship. Something drifted by, you caught it, and you absorbed it. Now, for the first time, one can chase another one and eat it. And this, of course, opens up untold opportunity for further innovation. Who can run the fastest, who can hide the fastest, who can camouflage, and so on. So how far back do we have to go in the evolutionary lineage? Well, this first appeared with the jellyfish. To be more precise, the cnidarians and the ctenophores, but let's just call them jellyfish. These are not bilaterally symmetric, these are round animals. And shortly after that, then, we get the development of bilaterally symmetric bodies and all kinds of interesting forms of locomotion. But it was with the jellyfish, or the common ancestor of the jellyfish, and all other ambulant life forms that we first find muscles and nervous systems. Nervous systems and muscles go together. Nervous systems and muscles are unthinkable without each other. Now we see an echo of this today in a very simple animal not unlike the jellyfish. This is an animal called a sea squirt. And I'll let Daniel Dennett, the philosopher of cognitive science, describe it. He says, the juvenile sea squirt wanders through the sea, searching for a suitable rock or hunk of coral to cling to and make its home for life. For this task, it has a rudimentary nervous system. When it finds its spot and takes root, it doesn't need its brain anymore, so it eats it. It's rather like getting tenure. As someone who has tenure, I feel obliged to comment that it's not quite like getting tenure, but there you go. Dan Dennett slightly misrepresents things here. The sea squirt has a life cycle which involves a metamorphosis. It doesn't eat its brain. There's a metamorphosis that transitions from one form of morphological organization to another, just as miraculous as a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. In the process of metamorphosis, the ganglia, it doesn't have a brain, it has a... ganglia are pre-brains, if you like. They're little local accumulations of nerves with reciprocal connections. So they get digested. Because nervous system tissue is metabolically very expensive, it consumes a lot of resources. These are well spent if you have to deal with an uncertain environment as you drift through the waters or swim through the waters looking for a spot to live. But having settled down for life, as these creatures do, then you really don't need it anymore. So I said locomotion appears for the first time here, and I said that there are basic principles that underlie all locomotion in all animals. That includes the jellyfish, the centipedes, ants, and us. And they all involve the coordination of pulsating elements, oscillating elements, whether it's your legs or the 100 legs of a millipede or the body of a jellyfish. All locomotion is achieved through rhythmic pulsation of some kind. Now this has caused animators no end of problem because it's quite difficult to draw locomotion. It's difficult to draw people walking. And in Monty Python, their famous animator Terry Gilliam chose at an early stage to often take a shortcut and give his characters wheels, which made them much easier to animate because a wheel just goes around. So why, given the creativity of evolution, why do we not find the wheel in nature? Why did it not come up with the wheel? We invented the wheel and we find it incredibly useful for getting things around. Of course, wheels require roads and nature doesn't come equipped with roads, but nonetheless, the wheel is a really, really good idea. Now, a wheel is not a spinning disc. A wheel is a spinning disc on an axle, and the axle stays fixed as the wheel rotates. As we look through all the animal kingdom, we have difficulty finding the wheel, but we do find it. We find it in the E. coli bacterium, and we find it as a means of propulsion. The bacterium is a single cell, of course, and it moves by spinning its wheel, which causes its flagellae, long whip-like appendages, to rotate, driving it forwards. So nature did find the wheel, but we don't see wheels everywhere. Well, the problem is one of scale. If you think about the construction of a wheel, a disc rotates around a fixed axle. At the size of a single cell, all the parts of that machinery can be supplied with nutrients and can have their waste matter taken away through processes of chemical diffusion. It's relatively slow, but it works great at small scales. As you scale up the animal, now, you're faced with the problem that a wheel has to be unattached to the axle, has to spin around the fixed axle. That means that there's no possible provision of blood vessels, lymph vessels, wires, cables that can be done to provision that wheel. So biological tissue needs to take care of its needs. All tissue consumes energy, all tissue produces waste products. And so the wheel, while it was found by nature, just doesn't scale up very well. So there is a landmark figure in the history of movement science who's very entertaining. And this is Edward Muybridge, pictured there on the right. He spelled his name in various ways. I've chosen one of them there. Edward Muybridge was a pioneer who was working in the 19th century in California. He had a very, very interesting background. He was a photographer, and photography was an infant science at the time. And he was one of the guys who led the charge in documenting many of the natural wonders of California, Yosemite, and petrified trees and such like. And he was a colourful character. He got into a spot of bother once. He found his wife in bed with another man and promptly shot him, killed him. And he was hauled up before the judge, and this being, I think, the 1860s or thereabouts in the Wild West, the judge said, why did you kill him? And he laid out the facts, and the judge more or less said, well, that's what you're going to do, right? And he got off on that charge. Despite all this colour, Edward Muybridge provided us with a most wonderful, wonderful work. And this is the intense studies he did of human and animal locomotion. He set up an enormous studio in which a series of cameras could be triggered by tripwires. Exposing a camera plate that is capturing a single image was a slow process. And he was at the cutting edge, so that was fairly fast by the time he was building his studio. But the time taken to reload your camera, to take one plate out and put another plate in, precluded the generation of rapid succession of images. So he solved this by having lots and lots of cameras all ready to go and having them fire at very, very precise times. In this way, it was possible to answer a kind of question that floated around bar rooms in California in the 1870s. Does a horse have all 4 feet off the ground when galloping? Now, you are so used to images that this must seem like a non-question to you. But photography at this stage was only in its birth pangs. Moving pictures didn't exist until Edward Muybridge came along and did this beautiful study, one of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of beautiful studies. And here, from his careful work, we can clearly see the form of locomotion. And his exquisite photography allowed the form of locomotion to be documented and studied in a wide variety of, he had ostriches, he had hippopotamuses, he had people who couldn't walk, he had acrobats, he had infants. Marvelous, marvelous work. I thoroughly recommend it. So, when we come to study movement, as opposed to behavior, when we come to study movement, we need to be careful about the role that we assign the brain. There is, in our discourse, in our popular discourse, a thoroughly mistaken notion of the brain as the superordinate controller, that the brain controls the body. In fact, you've been told that since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. You've been told the brain controls the body. Well, at least in the case of locomotion, that ain't so. If it were, then we would have a cycle like this. The brain decides where the foot should go next. Then the brain figures out which muscle combination will get it there, because the muscles are simply controlled, driven. And then the brain commands those muscles to move just enough. And so that would be a terribly laborious way to walk. That is not what is going on in locomotion. Notice the verbs that I've used here. Brains, I remind you, are organs of the body made of meat. They do not decide. Brains don't figure stuff out. Brains don't see. Brains don't feel. Despite the pronouncements of Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize winner, whose pioneering work on DNA so affected the world, you are not your brain. Brains are not people. All of this unfortunate explanatory load that we place on brains stems from a desire that we be in control, that we see ourselves, that we come up with a scientific picture in which we are autonomous and control things. It introduces a bizarre notion of the brain as a kind of a puppeteer yanking the strings of the body, telling it where to go. There's a puppet. And when we talk about the brain in that unfortunate way, what we're doing is turning the body into the giraffe here, and the brain is given the role of the puppeteer. Now let's have a look at this little puppet. There's a giraffe puppet with 4 strings. 4 strings is quite a lot excuse me, to control. If you have a puppet like this, getting it to do smooth, fluid, coordinated movement is quite an art. And you'll see that even this puppeteer, with only 4 strings to pull, has made things simpler by arranging the 4 strings so that they're not independent of each other, by attaching them to a fixed rig above, so that a single movement of the hand can have distributed effects across all 4 strings. This introduces a notion, a very important notion, of degrees of freedom. If we regard each string attached to that giraffe as a separate locus of control, then this giraffe has 4 degrees of freedom. There are 4 things that could be moved independently. Because those 4 degrees of freedom are all attached to the same rigid rod at the top, there are less than 4 effective degrees of freedom. What you do with one string here will affect what happens to all the other ones. Now, when we walk, our 2 legs are not independent of each other. There you go, there's walking. Each leg goes through a cycle, and the 2 cycles are linked. You're not moving one leg independently of the other. If I know that you're walking and I know where one leg is, I know where the other leg is, more or less. This is a very, very simple pattern. It's one of the simplest patterns that we see in nature, is 2 oscillating elements adopting a fixed relationship like this. We call it coupling. There's an awful lot of repetition and not a great deal of complexity. And this general observation about locomotion applies to horses galloping, dogs, spiders crawling, or even a millipede walking. What we see in each case is pairs of effectors, legs, wings, which are non-independent during the task of walking. Now, walking we've just characterized as a behavior because we've said during the task of walking, they are non-independent of each other. So we're leaning on something of a goal-based description here, but we're very careful because we have good reason to believe that locomotion is an appropriate way to describe what animals are doing a lot of the time. Oh, there they go. Now, there's a little poem written about the problems the brain faces if the brain were to try to control the body. The centipede was happy quite until a toad in fun said, "Pray, which leg moves after which?" This raised her doubts to such a pitch she fell exhausted in a ditch, not knowing how to run. If a centipede stopped to think, it would be impossible to walk. There's a little experiment you could do, and don't do this. You could take a centipede and you can pull off its legs in pairwise fashion. Don't do this. And what you would find is that the centipede would, after each such intervention, would immediately adopt a smooth, continuous, coordinated gait. Centipedes are animals of very, very little brain, and yet have no difficulty dealing with an entirely novel number of legs. Clearly, the complexities of leg organization are not to be referred to the central controlling functions, hypothetical functions of the brain. Rather, there are some very general principles here which will allow us better to understand locomotion across all examples that we meet. So, we can even mimic this. We can mimic walking with our fingers. Look at that. We can do this, and when we do that, the 2 fingers become non-independent of each other in the service of the goal, which is locomotion. Now, remember our giraffe with its 4 degrees of freedom. If we consider the brain to be controlling things and movement, how many strings are there? How many degrees of freedom? Now, we can count these in various ways. When I reach for a coffee cup and pick up a coffee cup, I've moved my arm, and there's many trajectories I could move it in to get to the coffee cup. As I do so, there are three main joints to consider. There's the shoulder, there's the elbow, and there's the wrist, and they're all frightfully complicated. We're going to simplify greatly. Let's start with the elbow. It's a hinge joint, so a single string, if you like, could control this. That's 1 degree of freedom. With the shoulder, we've got full 360 degree movement. We can, as it were, latitude, longitude, and rotation are all possible, so that's basically a 3 degree of freedom joint. And the wrist is a horrendously complicated thing, but we can basically move it side to side, front to back, and rotate as well. So that's another 3 degrees of freedom. So it looks like there are 7 degrees of freedom that need to be controlled in order for me to pick up a coffee cup. But the brain cannot set a joint angle directly. Each joint movement is controlled by multiple muscles, and each of those muscles is potentially independently controllable, as when we recruit the muscles, a certain set of muscles for one task, and then recruit a different set of muscles, partially overlapping with the previous set, for a different task. So the number of degrees of freedom just went up, scaled up by the number of muscles. But each muscle is, of course, not a simple thing. They consist of separate muscle packages, and those packages break down further and further and further until you eventually end up at the level of the individual nerve, which is making contact with a muscle. That number went from 7 to billions. There are impossibly too many degrees of freedom for each to be separately controlled. This basic insight, which must inform our understanding of the role of the brain in movement, was first made in the 1920s by a Russian physiologist called Nikolai Bernstein. Bernstein was another innovator in photography and recording movement. A little later than Edward Muybridge, he found a way to attach lights to various parts of the body and to record these with what at the time was an extremely high frame rate. I believe he got up to like 50 frames a second or something like this. And he did so studying skilled action. So here, for example, one of the cases he studies was blacksmiths hammering on an anvil. And he would attach point lights to various parts of the blacksmith and to the hammer and record them and analyze the variability in the movement from one blow to the next. Now, the guiding thought of the brain as a controller makes very strong predictions about what you will find in the variability here. So if the brain is sending messages, as we loosely say, to the shoulder to tell it where to go, and then sending messages to the elbow, telling it where to go, and sending messages to the wrist, the brain as controller view predicts very strongly that the variability at the shoulder, there will be some variability, some noise, it's a biological system, that will add to any variability introduced at the elbow, which will add to any variability introduced at the wrist, so that the amount of variability from one cycle to the next should increase as you get further away from the brain, and should be maximized at the hammer, which of course is only temporarily connected to the brain because the blacksmith is holding it. What he found was almost the opposite of this. The variability in this particular task was minimized at the point of contact of the hammer with the anvil. And the joints did not move independently of one another. Any perturbation, any variability introduced into the system was flexibly counteracted by all the other parts of the system. It's almost as if the blacksmith had become a self-correcting hammering system. The joints don't act independently, they correct each other's movement. This rules out any attempt to understand the brain as a controller of the muscles. And that should come as a bit of a shock. We tend to think intuitively that all behaviors must arise from controller. We tend to think of behavior as being like driving a car, there must be a driver. Well, your body is not a car, and positing a driver in your head is not going to be much help. When we look at movement, a wide variety of movements across the animal kingdom, and we uncover the basic principles underlying movement, we come up with a very different picture. Now, we'll discuss this further in the next video.